Welcome to Module 2, which covers the grain production component of agriculture. This module is broken up into two parts. Part 1 will cover maize and wheat production, and Part 2 rice and soybean production. We start with the grain crops since the three major grain crops, maize or corn, rice, and wheat, make up approximately half of the world's agricultural base food supply. Grain crops are usually divided into two groups. The first group includes those grains that are intended for human consumption, while the second group are grains that will be fed to animals as feed. Many of these food and feed grains consist of seeds from plants in the grass family. This includes wheat, rice, maize, barley, sorghum, and millet. Another important grain comes from the seed of plants referred to as legumes. Examples here include soybeans, peanuts, lentils, beans, cowpeas, and chickpeas. There are other grains of economic value which are considered oil crops. These include sunflower, safflower, and mustard. Grain crops are considered a primary staple of both the developed and developing world due to their easily digestible high-quality starches and proteins. This chart illustrates the 2013 major grain production in quantity and in millions of metric tons. Maize, rice, wheat, and soybeans are ranked number 2, 3, 4, and 8 among all globally produced agricultural-based foods. Here it becomes obvious that maize, rice, and wheat are dominant in the grain production industries. While genetically modified soybeans, despite being a relatively new crop, are experiencing steady production increases and is fast becoming a major contributor in the oilseed markets. All other grains equal only slightly more than 10% of total grain production combined. Whereas the last chart looked at the total quantity of grain production, this chart considers the international dollar value that grain crops represent. Grains are not only a major source of global food supply, they represent a significant economic value to countries. Income derived from grain production provides the U.S. alone a net balance of trade from surplus production in cereal grains approaching over $20 billion a year. Rice dominates the major production grains in terms of overall dollar value. However, on the international level, wheat and corn actually have the highest trading volumes. Rice is much less important in international trade because most rice is consumed within the country of which it's produced. There are large variations among the different varieties of maize depending on the region. Maize is classified according to its visible differences or characteristics, which include color, grain size, and grain types. Maize has been able to adapt to many different climates and growing season lengths. It is currently planted at elevations ranging from sea level all the way to 14,000 meters or 13,000 feet in altitude. Large-scale maize production is currently taking place from southern Canada and the Russian steppes in the northern hemisphere, all the way to Argentina and South Australia in the southern hemisphere. Primary uses of maize include as a feedstock, as a biofuel or ethanol, as a sweetener, namely high fructose corn syrup, for corn starches and corn oils, as ingredients used in food processing, and for human consumption. It can be eaten fresh or ground into tortilla flour. It can be made into cornbreads or prepared as a thickening agent for soups. Maize has the highest consumption rates in Mexico and Central America, where it can provide as much as 70% of all caloric intake and up to 84% of the region's protein. This map illustrates the regions where maize production occurs. The darker regions represent higher levels of production output. Maize is being grown in most of the countries around the world and represents the most widely planted global grain crop. Global maize production almost reached 873 million metric tons in 2012, with a worldwide production value of over $53 billion. Maize is also the #1 crop used in industrial food processing purposes, comprising up to 40% of all ingredients used in processed foods. The leading maize-producing countries in terms of both quantity and production value are the United States and the People's Republic of China. The United States produced almost 274 million metric tons and China over 205 million metric tons. Combined, they are responsible for almost half of all maize production. For the United States, it is the number one grain crop in both quantity, value, and in exports. Additional major producers include Brazil, India, Mexico, Argentina, and the Ukraine. In many of the world's developed countries, maize and sorghum are produced using very mechanized procedures. There are generally two systems of soil preparation that are used. These include conventional tillage systems or minimum or zero tillage systems. Tillage is best described as the agricultural preparation process of soil by means of a mechanical agitation by either digging, stirring, or overturning the soil. Some regions of the world use zero tillage or no tillage farming methods. In this manner, crops are grown or pastured from one year to the next without the soil ever being disturbed through the tillage process. Under a conventional tillage process, a field will be plowed with a moldboard plow, which lifts and turns over the top 7 inches of soil. The purpose is to loosen the soil and bury any weeds. This also allows the new seedlings a better chance at root penetration. Tillage systems are very energy-intensive procedures, requiring large tractors and additional heavy farming equipment. It also requires multiple trips over the same fields to ensure that the soil is properly prepped for planting. Minimum or zero tillage systems reduce tillage requirements to a minimum or in some cases none at all. In this case, specialized planters are used to fill a narrow strip, or they will plant seedlings directly in the soil that has been undisturbed since the prior year. This method significantly reduces planting but allows for weeds to grow unchecked. To counter this requires the use of chemical fertilizers and herbicides, which are applied either before or during the planting and is necessary to kill the surrounding weeds and give the seedlings the opportunity to grow. Farmers have been using zero or minimum tillage for centuries in the developed world. Maize is a very nutrient-hungry crop. Each corn plant produces a heavy stalk with a large number of broad leaves, usually grown in a relatively short period of time, and results in a nutrient-dense grains or kernels. For each kilogram of maize that is harvested, the soil will lose approximately 16 grams of nitrogen, 7 grams of phosphate, and 5 grams of potash, which will need to be replaced through some form of fertilization, which is usually chemical fertilizers. Many maize varieties have been selectively bred to be able to produce grain in fields with low fertility levels. The application of animal manure can further reduce the need for chemical fertilizers and help preserve the soil. Chemical fertilizer use has also been reduced by growing a legume crop in the field the season before the corn crop is planted. The residual nitrogen from the legume crop is good for up to 3 years after the legume crop has been harvested and plowed under. However, for most industrial farms, they prefer chemical fertilizers due to the lower cost and ease of application. While this is economically beneficial, weeds have become a major problem for maize production, since heavy applications of chemical fertilizers also result in rapid weed growth. Herbicides can be applied during the time that the maize is planted, which reduces weed growth and gives the new corn seedlings time to grow without excessive competition. Traditional methods for weed control is extremely labor-intensive, requiring farm workers to pull weeds by hand. In large-scale farms of over 1,000 hectares, this is almost impossible to weed by hand. Insect management has been traditionally done by proper selection of maize varieties. Recently, modern maize hybrids have been genetically modified to be resistant to rootworms and leaf-eating insects. Maize harvesting is dependent on local climate and the type of farm operations that will be utilized. The simplest, most effective method is that of commercial or industrialized farming. Farmers drive large combines through their fields which remove the maize's ear or panicles. These ears are then run through shellers which separate the grain from the cobs, leaves, and stalks. Once the combine's grain bin is full, The shelled grain is unloaded into an awaiting truck. When the trucks become full, they are either driven to the farmer's on-site storage bins to be used for livestock feed or to wait for better market prices, or they can be driven to the local grain elevator for sale at the current market price. Maize harvesting on traditional farms or small farms in developing countries is usually done by hand. Local farmers are hired to gather the maize and twist off the ears. They are then collected and placed in a waiting wagon. The grain is then stored on local farms and in rat-proof bins to provide some level of protection against insects and moisture. Even with these measures, 30 to 40% losses are common. To offset this, the cob is usually left with the husk intact to provide additional levels of protection against insects. Stored maize can also become infected by toxin-producing fungi regardless of the type of farm or the protection measures taken. These fungi can be very dangerous if consumed by humans or animals. Post-harvesting will depend upon the end user. For livestock, the grain may be only minimally processed or not processed at all. For human consumption, especially in developing countries, maize will go through some level or some stage of processing and be developed into multiple raw food ingredients. Pictures can be worth 1,000 words. The image at the top left shows a combine gathering maize and distributing the shelled grain onto a separate tractor hauling a grain bin. This is offset by the labor-intensive practices of traditional maize production. The image here shows corn harvesting by laborers as they gather the maize by hand, remove the cobs by hand, and load them onto the bin. The bottom two images are of a commercial cornfield and an individual corn plant with the ears pulled back to show the cob in full view. Wheat is generally grown in countries that have mild or temperate seasons. There is very limited production in any very humid or tropic zones. Wheat is classified by its different grain characteristics and the season in which it will be planted in, and grown primarily for human consumption. Wheat cultivation is best conducted in regions where the annual rainfall will be between 14 and 24 inches. If the wheat type that will be used is going to produce bread, the minimal annual rainfall should be about 18 inches. Wheat can also be grown very well under irrigated conditions if rainfall levels are inadequate or irregular. Wheat is the main staple of all Western diets and is consumed as either breads, pastas, or pastries. Each pound of the grain can produce 1,500 calories and provide up to 20% of the total food intake in all countries in the developing world. In the Middle East and North Africa, MENA countries, it can provide almost 45% of the total food supply. Wheat and barley are considered part of the grass family. Some varieties of wheat can reach 78 inches in height. However, the commercial varieties are usually between 42 and 48 inches. The plant's actual grain is referred to as its terminal spike, which you can see in this image. In terms of global grain production, wheat is second only to maize or corn. Global wheat production has traditionally been considerably less than global maize production. In 2012, it barely reached 672 million metric tons. Yet its worldwide production value has exceeded maize production, reaching over $79 billion last year. In the United States, wheat represents the number 3 grain crop produced behind maize and soybeans, both in terms of quantity and in terms of dollar value. The leading countries in terms of hectares of wheat planted is China and India, followed by the United States, France, and Russia. China and India each have a total production value of approximately $14 billion, despite China producing 121 million metric tons versus India's 95 million metric tons. Soil preparation involves plowing and disking soil to form uniform seed beds. With small grains like wheat, the soil will have to be tilled until new dirt clods are no larger than the size of the seed itself. In highly mechanized industrial farms, there are several different implements that can be used to break the soil down into smaller fragments. The first pass usually involves a plow that is designed to turn over the topsoil and bury any weeds that are present. A second and or third pass will utilize a disc that breaks up the larger dirt clods. Occasionally an additional pass is needed using another disc implement that further reduces the size of any remaining dirt clods. A mechanical planter is then used to plant the grains in rows about 8 inches apart. As many as one seed every half inch can be planted in this manner. Some mechanized farms in the developed world have reduced tillage requirements to almost zero with the use of no-till planters. Specialized machines are used to open a thin select or open row in the untilled soil and then drop a combination of seed and starter fertilizer. While this reduces the number of tillage operations, it requires the use of extensive herbicides to kill any weeds existing in the field. In the non-mechanized traditional farms, the soil will be tilled repeatedly until a smooth seedbed is formed. The seeds are then broadcast by hand, attempting to form a uniform distribution. Finally, the seeds will be plowed using a stick plow, which lightly covers over the seeds with soil. Fertilization is necessary to provide the soil with the amount of nutrients equal to the nutrients that existed in the field prior to the previous planting. For example, a harvest of 4,400 kilograms of wheat taken from 1 hectare will require the replacement of 90 kilograms of nitrogen, 43 kilograms of phosphate, and 27 kilograms of potash through some form of fertilization. For large industrial farms, the replacement of nutrients is usually accomplished with chemical fertilizers. As with the case of corn production, this amount can be reduced if the fertilizer use is supplemented with manure acquired from farm animals. The amount of fertilizer that is required will often depend on the type of grain that is being produced. Chemical fertilizers are often very expensive. This means that they'll usually be reserved for high-value crops like vegetables. Weed control for wheat can be difficult due to the narrow rows that makes herbicides very difficult to apply. Tractors or plow animals, whether it be in conventional or traditional farms, cannot easily maneuver through the rows for cultivation. Traditional farms, where seed beds are broadcast by hand, the plants end up being randomly spaced, and this makes weed control even more difficult to manage. Numerous insect species will feed on wheat plants at any of their growth stages. However, most damage is not severe enough to require the use of expensive insecticides. Disease, on the other hand, can be a major problem for wheat. Leaf rust can result in 80 to 90% crop losses. Resistant strains are always under development, but fungi like leaf rust has a wide range of genetic variability and can readily mutate to overcome resistance. On large industrial farms, mechanical harvesting of wheat is conducted with combine harvesters. Most harvesters are self-propelled, capable of moving through the wheat fields, cutting away the dry stalks. They can then feed these wheat stalks and spikes through rollers and sieves designed to remove the grains from the spikes. Mechanical harvesting of wheat has to wait until the grain itself is dried to about 15% moisture level. If the grain is harvested when it is too moist, the threshing process can be incomplete, resulting in the need to artificially dry the grain after harvesting, thus increasing its costs. If the grain is too dry or below the 10% moisture level, harvesting runs the risk of cracking and damaging the grains, reducing their quality and sale price. Traditional manual harvesting of wheat can be a very labor-intensive process. Typically, the grain is cut with a hand cycle or a scythe. It is then gathered by farmhands or laborers, tied into bundles, and carried to a central threshing area where the grain will be separated. Storage can be another big problem for wheat in this environment. If the grain is stored too moist, mold or fungus can form. Insects can also damage stored grains, and their larvae can be voracious, eating the starchy interior of the plant and even possibly contaminating it. Rodents are also problematic. What they don't outright eat is usually considered contaminated and unfit for human consumption. This final slide shows images of wheat harvesting. The image at the top left shows the industrialized farming practice of using combine wheat harvesters to gather wheat. Contrast that to the more traditional wheat harvesting methods used in the developing world, where laborers are the primary means of gathering the wheat. The bottom two images are of commercial wheat fields and individual wheat spikes and stalks. At this time, I would recommend watching the 2016 Modern Wheat Harvest video. This will give a better illustration of what the processes are from a real-time perspective.